Good evening, and welcome to the first edition of our webinar we're calling City Talks, where, as council member for District 2, I'm looking to bring the issues that affect us outside of our borders to bear on Pasadena. Sometimes those issues are known as glocal. They're both global and have local implications. And I'm really honored to have as my first guest Catherine Bracey. She is the CEO and co-founder of an organization called Tech Equity, which has made quite a splash and is performing a very important function. We'll talk more about that. She's also the author of this book, World Eaters, um, How Venture Capital is Cannibalizing the Economy. We'll spend a lot of time on that. Um, Catherine was a founding partner of a side hustle in the soccer world, and maybe you can say a word about that at some point. And is on the board of the Turner Housing Innovation Labs at Berkeley, board member of the Data and Society Research Institute, as well as the Public Laboratory for Open Technology and Science. I think that you were a member of that board. And you spent 3 years in leadership at Code for America, a startup that helped revolutionize and bring tech consciousness and savvy to local governments all over the country. So we're going to talk tonight about venture capital. And let's start with when you first, this really came on your radar screen as a resident of Oakland.
Yeah. So first of all, thanks for having me. It's a pleasure to be joining you. And I of course know you because you were one of those innovators in local government who we worked with at Code for America. So thrilled to see you continuing this work. Um, yeah, I came to the idea for the book as part of my work at Code for America, or I'm sorry, at Tech Equity, which, as you mentioned, I founded about 10 years ago. And at Tech Equity, we're working on issues at the intersection of tech and economic equity with a focus on the areas in people's lives that have the most impact on their economic well-being. So where they work, their labor conditions, affordability, and then corporate power, which is, the thing that is driving both working conditions and the cost of living. And as we were starting to dig in on one issue in particular, which was labor conditions and labor conditions that were driven by the tech industry, in particular the gig economy, we were working closely with several labor organizers trying to work out how we might design different modes for gig companies that could take advantage of the labor opportunity that they were presenting to people to like earn more money on the side without also exploiting them and driving down working conditions at the same time. And I had a moment, like an epiphany, as we were having a conversation about how to plan this out, that I didn't know when in the life cycle of a startup like Uber they would ever be able to incorporate these kinds of practices because it feels like, on a Tuesday, they are three-person startups with don't know if they're gonna be around in, 6 months and really just doesn't make sense for them to be thinking about these longer term projects that may take, 12 months to even get off the ground. And then overnight, by the end of the week, they're this, too big to fail global behemoth that it's too late to incorporate these practices. The horse has already left the barn. And it struck me that that was different. There was something different about the way that companies developed and the speed at which they grew into these like massive companies that were now too big to hold accountable. And I started thinking about that, and it occurred to me after a while of kind of turning these ideas over in my head that the unique thing about the tech sector was the financial structure that creates it. And once I kind of had that idea in my head, I couldn't let go of it. And so I started digging in on, what actually are the incentives that venture capital creates? So why is it such that, these venture-backed companies grow so fast and do so in a way that seems so careless? Is there something there at the root of, how these companies are conceived and funded that could really get at some of the foundational structural causes for why the tech industry seems to be, going in a direction that we don't want it to go. And if so, what could we do about that? And so that's basically the project of the book is to sort of investigate that, as much for myself as for the readers, and then to propose some solutions for how we might build an innovation economy that has, more pro-social values at its center.
That's why I was so excited to have you as the first guest on these City Talks. Is um, early in your book, you write our narrow focus on the technology itself, because we're obsessed with how technology is affecting our lives, because it is radically reshaping them. Our narrow focus on the technology itself, instead of the economic forces that surround it, has allowed venture capital to largely avoid scrutiny during the rise and fall of the second tech boom, even though every megalomaniacal founder who spectacularly crashed and burned, there were a dozen investors eagerly handing them the matches. And I was city manager in Santa Monica, as you may know, when Bird placed the first 10 for rent scooters on the street in downtown Santa Monica. He'd made some efforts to reach the city. The city didn't know what to do with him. And so he just started out on his own without any permission, without any certification. And then Bird became, first of all, created holy hell in our city for that summer, because once people rode on those scooters, they kind of got the hang of it. But the very first time they rode on it, they had no idea what they were getting into, and mowing down pedestrians and leaving them scattered on the streets. And the trouble is that in Santa Monica, every day during the summer, there's a whole bunch of new people who are arriving, and oh, look, there's a scooter. I'm going to ride on that. So it was really havoc. And of course, then Bird became an international company, well, Paris and Asia, and then largely crashed and burned, like many of these startups. We'll go into that role that venture capital plays in the background. We'll bring that to the foreground. I want to start, though. You acknowledge uh, right up front that venture capital and the companies that it has spawned have had very beneficial effects in many cases. We wouldn't have Google, we wouldn't have Genentech, we wouldn't have had Moderna and the vaccines that were so rapidly developed during COVID. So you acknowledge that there's some benefits, but where you start is that the short time horizons and the emphasis on breakneck growth is what is cannibalizing our economy. And we're going to talk about its impact on labor. We're going to talk on its impact on startup businesses and existing businesses and local businesses. And we're going to talk about its effect on homeownership in our communities and around the country. Well, we've got a lot of ground to cover, so let's get into it. Let's start. You in the book, you say that coming out of World War II, there was really no place for startups because banks often were too conservative to lend to people with new and innovative ideas. And Wall Street really catered to big corporations, to established, mature companies. And so the technology, which has been the leading edge of venture capital, although as you relate, venture capital has gone far beyond technology in its impact. But tell us a little bit about the history of how venture capital developed to fill that need.
Yeah, I mean, it was sort of developed, invented, pioneered in the middle of the 20th century. And, as you mentioned, it was in part, there was the identification of a problem that there were all these new technologies that had been spurred by the war and the post-war boom that didn't have any space to sort of realize their potential, their commercial potential. And it was a drag on the economy. There just wasn't a lot of like vibrancy, robustness in the economy. If new technologies were going to come to market, they were likely to come out of R&D arms of existing corporations that, for a bunch of reasons just aren't as innovative as, somebody who's coming from the outside might be. And so some civic and business leaders identified this problem, and it was also about the Cold War as well. I think there was a lot of impetus to, prove that capitalism could deliver a better life than communism, and so they needed to find these new engines of growth in the economy. And so these sort of factors caused a set of civic and business leaders to come together and say, like, how can we attract more what's called risk capital into the financial system? These investors who are willing to take the risk that, on these very unproven technologies that are more than likely to fail, but if they succeed, will provide a lot of upside opportunity, and be really good for economic growth. And so, long story short, they settled on the basic structure that still exists today for venture capital, which came out of the whaling industry, which was also a very high risk endeavor back in the late 19th century. These ships would go out for years and it was very dangerous and it wasn't clear whether they would come back with, it would be very much feast or famine. And investors at that time realized that if they pooled the assets of wealthy individuals across and then spread them across a portfolio of ship ventures and captains, that they would be, the average return across all of the ships could, provide something that would make it worth it to invest in. And that average would be, a couple of really good hauls and a whole lot of ones that, either never came back or, came back with almost nothing. And that basic structure, which is called the portfolio structure, has been applied to venture capital. So these leaders hypothesized that if they organized capital in a portfolio approach, pooling capital from a set of sort of wealthy individuals and institutions, and then hiring expert agents, which would be the venture capitalists, to make the informed decisions about how to allocate that capital across a portfolio of startups, that at the end of the day, the average return would make it worth it to invest.
We're
And
going to
that
get into
return,
that right now, but first I want to note that again, in tracing this history in your book, we talk about the role of government. Government actually played an important enabling role in all of this. You cite I had no idea that William Casey, the head of the CIA, played a major role in creating the framework for venture capital through the government policies and laws, and then the beginning of the lowering of capital gains, which has been lowered several times since, has also spurred this hot money of money that
yeah.
isn't going into banks, isn't going into stocks, and it is looking for a much higher rate of return from people who have enough money to be able to take these risks.
Yeah, and I mean at the time, and that all came after the hypothesis was proven. So the first kind of forerunner of what became modern VC was a fund that was started in the 50s, and sort of proved out the hypothesis in the 60s. And then, this is still sort of a backwater of the financial system. I don't even know, many people probably wouldn't even consider it part of the financial system at the time. But, some crazy folks in Silicon Valley, which was at the time not Silicon Valley yet, and in Boston around sort of MIT and Harvard, sort of took this hypothesis and started to run with it. And by the 70s, and I think the timing is not coincidental, this was really like the beginning of the deregulatory neoliberal economic era. Um, that era of our economic history really tracks the trajectory of the rise of venture capital. And so in the 70s, you started seeing government, start to get involved. A lobbying arm of the National Venture Capital Association sprung up. They started lobbying very heavily to lower the capital gains rate, make it possible for pension funds to invest in venture capital funds, which had been illegal up to then, and really kind of open the floodgates to these other institutional investors, insurance companies, et cetera, to put their money into venture capital funds. And after that happened, it really blew up. And at first it was, I mean, sorry, to
Go
your
ahead.
point, like it was good. It was good. I mean, I think that it was filling a real need in the system to fund these really risky breakthrough companies that were bringing technologies to market that otherwise probably wouldn't have seen the light of day, like mass market insulin and vaccines, as you mentioned. Um, and, as it matured, it started to sort of lose its tether to its original purpose. And there are a variety of
Where I
ways
want
as
to,
it,
yeah,
yeah.
that's where I want to go next is you note you cite an example from that sort of transition period, a company, a venture capital firm called Horsley Bridge, which invested in 7,000 startups. And this is really an astonishing statistic, but it turns out to be the beginning of this fundamental change. Um, that just 6% of those 7,000 produced 60% of the results.
Yeah.
And what you outline is how that's just accentuated as funds became bigger. Um, the curve has tightened, and you talk about the power law. Share with our listeners what the power law is and why it's so central to modern venture capital.
Yeah, and Horsley Bridge is actually not a VC firm. It is an institutional investor that invests in VC funds. So
Ah,
they're looking at across all of the VC funds that they invest in, those 7,000 funds, the returns look like what is called a power law. And that's that dynamic I was describing where a very small number of companies within a portfolio will drive the average up on its own and more than make up for the much larger number of companies that will fail or not produce very much of a return. And that is true both within a portfolio, and it's also true within the venture capital industry that there are just a small number of venture capital funds that drive the outperformance of the entire venture capital industry. Most venture capital funds don't do any better than you would if you just invested in an S&P 500 index fund. And so that dynamic is called the power law, and the power law is the sort of religion of Silicon Valley that has taken hold in a way that I think has become extremely unhealthy. And that's where I ended up, along this journey of trying to understand how venture capital worked and in its role in, creating these negative incentives around technology. That's what I came to find is that actually the initial purpose of venture capital that it was constructed for in the middle of the 20th century was not really the purpose that it was serving now. It has now become really like just about everything else in our economy, about financializing an asset, and startups are the asset in this case.
go back to the whaling analogy. Um, it spread risk and it gave the opportunity for a risky business to be a going concern. But in this case, a whaler would have to come back with 10,000 or 100,000 sperm whales because what you outline is that more and more, not only has it become a quest for that billion-dollar unicorn that grows from two or three employees to a giant, but even a mega unicorn of $50 billion and that those are less than a needle in a haystack, and that distorts because you're looking for that needle in that haystack. All the rest of the hay in the haystack gets ignored or thrown away.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, I think this is what happened over the last 40 years is this, the what began as an observation. The power law was really an observation of what happens in a venture capital fund when you seek out risky technologies that could be breakthroughs, but have, a lot of downside potential as well. And the natural, organic way that your fund will look if you invest in those types of companies is a power law. Will look like you're likely to have a very small number of very high performers and a very high number of very low performers. And people took that observation and and the game of venture capital became about trying to reverse engineer that portfolio distribution rather than becoming about trying to find breakthrough technologies that would really create outsized value in society and the economy. And that's where it became about financializing this. This is where sort of Wall Street got into it and started gaming it. And it really got away from, finding technologies that could change our lives and more about, tinkering with business models in order to milk as much out of them as you could as fast as possible and using software and other digital technologies to facilitate that.
You really say that eloquently early on. The aim of venture capitalists is not to identify the companies that are building something of great value and, if successful, would have huge financial upside. That's the Warren Buffett model of investing, and he was very successful at picking solid companies that would produce long-term high returns. Instead, venture capital have fallen into this cycle where the aim of venture capital is to identify the companies that have huge financial upside, period. Just it's all about money, not about value, and not even about longevity, not even about a company
Yeah.
that's going to be around for 10 years. If you can grow it to $1 billion company in 2 years, everybody can cash out.
Yeah, and I mean the trick is with these, startups is that they're so young when the investor is investing in them that they don't know which of these companies in the portfolio are going to be that high achiever. So the way that they optimize for this power law return is to force every company to run the same playbook, which is basically, the playbook that Uber ran. It's what Bird ran when it came to LA. I mean, it is the, drop the product in and ask questions later, hit them with overwhelming speed before they even know what's happening. And then, oops, it's too late. We're already here. We're too big for you to regulate us. We've already got all your customers locked in. You're going to have to figure it out now after the fact and like pushing
Move
all of the risk on to other people and not onto the company.
famously, move fast and break things.
Move
And
fast and break that.
and we're going to now talk about some of the things that get broken, some of the broken pottery that's scattered in their wake. And let's start. You start actually in an intriguing way. The entrepreneurs themselves, in many ways, are the victims of this. First of all, the vast majority of them fail, and some of them are forced into failure by growing too fast or growing in a way that's not conducive to their long-term survival. In that effort to produce that needle in the haystack, a lot of the rest of the hay gets burned. So you talk about that, and so do even so if there are five people with a similar idea, the one that blitz scales, and you can talk about what that um, is likely to overwhelm the other four, even
Yeah.
if the other four have a more sustainable business model. So blitz
Yeah. So
scale.
just to talk about the math a little bit and why this ends up being so destructive to entrepreneurship. In order to you know, have a fund where the outsized performers are more than making up for the losers, the bigger the fund size is. So if you have a $2 billion fund, obviously the size of the big winners within the fund has to be much larger than if you had a $200 million fund, right? 10 times larger, whatever. So, um, so there are obviously the bigger the fund gets, the fewer number of companies there are that can be those outsized winners. However, doesn't really matter to venture capitalists because they make money as a percentage, a 2% flat rate off the top. No matter what happens, they get paid 2% of whatever the fund size is. So they are incentivized to raise funds that are as big as possible so that they can take, the bigger the fund, the more money they're getting with that 2%. And so this creates this dynamic where fund sizes have gotten so big, and the people who are putting money into the funds are just so FOMO. They've been bought into this hype. It's what's happening with AI right now. Like they have to be in these funds. And so they don't ask a lot of questions about like, wait, do you really need all this money? Like, where are you going to put it? This doesn't make any sense. They don't ask those questions. They just put the money in. The VCs cream the 2% off the top. And then the question becomes, well, how are we going to find these companies that can be this big? And so you have this vanishingly small number of companies that are actually able organically to produce that level of return. The vast majority, 99.99% of startups that get created every year are going to be much smaller. Their natural organic potential is much smaller than that. Now, that does not mean they are not valuable companies, right? They are building very valuable things for really important markets like housing and healthcare and, you name it. Things that are going to make our lives better, that are going to create real economic value, that are going to create jobs, that are going to do it in a way that doesn't, rely on exploitation and extraction in order to be successful. And those companies are looking around and saying, I don't know. I mean, I can't be that big, but I don't, the only way I can raise money is to tell them a story that I could be that big. And so I have to do that, or else I can't start my company, or I have to find somebody else to give me money. And like everybody's a VC. And so like I don't know what else to do. And so I talked to a lot of entrepreneurs who were in that position, who had really great ideas, were building awesome companies that could have created a lot of value, and were stuck in this position where they either had to shift themselves into something they weren't and drive, and like that corrupts what the fundamental, creates risk for this company that didn't need to exist in the first place, and also forces them to like push risk off to the rest of us. Or they, have to bootstrap and find other ways, put it on the credit card, or find other ways to fund this company. Meanwhile, they're competing with the company that has taken venture capital and can just steamroll them. Or they don't start their company at all. And
You
that was really,
document, I'm sorry,
yeah.
you document another realm of distortion, right? Venture capital is very geographically concentrated. It's also, and you point this out, the people in venture capital are looking for people who look like them, who almost always are white men. And so white men in Silicon Valley, young white men in Silicon Valley, and there's even a profile, like you dropped out of college, but you went to a fancy college to begin with, and you can be handed hundreds of millions of dollars, and then the entrepreneur in inner city Cleveland, the entrepreneur in Missoula, Montana, the entrepreneur in New Mexico, that might as well be on a different planet. The nearly $500 billion that every single year goes into venture capital globally.
Yeah, I mean it is a side effect of this style of investing for sure. I think it's a really complicated, I mean, I've been working on this issue of the lack of diversity in VC for the last 15 years. Nothing has changed despite a lot of people's best efforts. I really have I think a more nuanced view about not why it is the way it is, but like what it would take to get us out of this place. And I think, I think what's happening is this logic, the power law logic, first of all, is forcing people into like they want the playbook, right? So they're looking at the companies that have already blitzscaled, and blitzscaling is just like one of these playbooks that is the move fast and break things approach. It's what Uber did essentially. Um, and they're looking at, okay, well, that company did it. That Facebook is, the type of return that I want. So what did Facebook do? And let me just roll that back. And so they look at that and just like pattern match everything. And it's like, oh, well, their founder was this type of person. And so we're going to look for people like that. And then, it becomes this self-fulfilling prophecy that then they're investing in the same types of people. And of course, because that's where they're putting the money, that's where the successes come from. And after a few cycles of that, you now have this mindset of like what the right type of founder looks like. And they also tend to be pursuing these markets, the ideas that are going to come out of, niche communities are likely ones that are just not going to have the market potential, right? They're going to be serving one of these smaller, societal needs. And that's not big enough for what, venture capital is trying to create one of these, grand slam returners that's going to drive the fund. They can't do some niche thing that's solving a specific problem in one community. They need to, have something that's going to take over the whole world. So I think that has a lot to do with it. And I think instead of doing these sort of charity programs where it's like we're going to create this fund over here for Black founders or women founders or whatever, I think we need a new approach to how we, construct the funds and the methodologies and the hypotheses. We need to go back to the drawing board. Like we just take it on faith that the power law is the only way to do it, but nobody has tried any other way. Nobody's actually tried to make money off of, you know, a more even distribution in the fund rather than a power law. And if we put some effort into that, I guarantee you we would see a lot more diverse founders in more diverse places doing lots of cool things that nobody else was thinking of.
Nobody's shedding tears for someone who spends 5 years sleeping on a cot in their office, working 7 days a week, because whether they're starting up a technology company or starting a local grocery store, a couple entrepreneurs in my neighborhood who are in that cycle, um, they signed up for that. But what you document in the book is the impact on the rest of us, because they're putting their blood, their sweat, and their tears, and they're trying to create something that works. And you talk about four different kinds of founders, and you might touch on that. But the founders that are seeking to actually create a business that customers want and need and will pay for over a long period of time, and that will actually fill a need in our economy, those are the businesses that get very little of the venture capital or get crushed by venture capital, either by participating or by being run over by people with the funding. And so we're missing out. There's at this for the same reason that we needed innovation capital 75 years ago. Now we have this huge hole of the folks who are willing to work their tails off to provide something valuable, from a
Yeah.
supermarket to pharmaceuticals. You mentioned later in the book about Butcher Block, which actually just decided not to go the venture capital route, and to grow more organically and has been successful.
Yeah, I mean, nobody's shedding a tear. Certainly in the realm of people you should feel sorry for, these entrepreneurs are pretty far down the list, especially these days. But, I, as a founder, not of a VC-backed startup, but, I am the founder of a type of corporation, a nonprofit corporation. I know what it's like to go out and have an idea that is really feels like your baby. You're putting your heart and your soul into this thing and you're taking it out there every day and asking people to say no to you 1,000 times just to hear yes once. And that is a big deal, I think, for people to put themselves out there like that. And and to have their dreams crushed in that way, where it's like, it's not even that it's a bad idea and that you should be doing something else. It's that, there's this system that is telling you that success is something that, we've redefined success into this thing that is extremely corrupted. I find that deeply tragic, and not just for those individuals, but for what it means to be an American entrepreneur. I mean, tragic is the word that I keep coming back to, that all of this potential ingenuity, optimism, everything that we really celebrate about, American innovation is just destroyed. It's trashed. It's thrown away. It's told it's not good enough because, there's this, sort of rigged, financialized system over here that is going to make some, rent-seeking landlords more money. I think that's a shame, a real shame, and not, for the people who are building the companies and what it teaches them about what it means to be a successful business person, for our economy. for our democracy. And so I do think people should shed a tear for that, and what we all miss out on, all the thousands and thousands of companies and solutions that have never seen the light of day because the system is so broken.
You make excellent points, and we're going to pivot to some of the other impacts on labor and housing. But I would just build on what you just said. This is not creating competition.
It's
Yes,
the opposite of competition.
it is growing new things, but those new things by the blitzscaling are aiming to choke off all competition. The whole goal of getting to being $1 billion corporation, to become Google, to become Amazon, to become Microsoft, is to be so big that you can either buy off or crush anything in your path. And to that's the whole secret of 5 and 10x returns, is that you have become uniquely a monopoly, or at least a duopoly. Maybe there's, Uber and Lyft, but you have crushed everything else in your path. And the result is tarnishing of, as you say, the American dream. Let's turn to a different piece of the American dream, which is to earn a good paying job, pay your taxes, send your kids to school, live a better life, and ultimately own a home. Um, what is the impact of this supercharged flow of money that's being it's really spraying like a fire hose at certain targets? What's the impact on people getting a job, the gig economy, the folks who are contracted out? You go into a great deal of detail about the impact of this on working people.
Yeah, I mean, I would say one of the effects of this, the sort of evolution of venture capital and the sort of the taking root of the power law dynamic, is that innovation moved from being focused, like it was not about like discovering technological innovation. It became about discovering business model innovation. Like, how could you use software to innovate on business models in a way that could squeeze more out of profit margins? And one of the most successful ways to do that has become what's called the marketplace or the platform business model, where basically these software companies just build a marketplace where you get buyers on one side and sellers on the other and match them together, and then the platform takes a cut of that transaction. Um, and Uber is maybe one of the most famous of these types of business models where they, claim to be connecting sort of small business owner drivers with riders who want a ride somewhere, or delivery people or whatever. Um, and then they take a cut of every transaction for making that match. In order for that business model to work at scale, they have to um, create the innovation is not so much on the platform they've built, it's on the way that they have been able to extract more from the employees. Because ultimately, I mean, if you look at Uber without all of the hype around it, it is a more efficient taxi company. Right. And what it is doing is providing a fleet of drivers to people who want to ride. And they have been able to use sort of business model innovation and regulatory obfuscation to actually put the drivers at arm's length. And if they were not able to do that, they never would have raised the venture capital that they raised to burn. It's like tens of billions of dollars that they just incinerated to build this company. And they never would have gotten to the size that they are today with the market share that they have. That was entirely predicated on the need to exploit workers. They never could, take responsibility for them in the way that an employer would have needed to, because investors never would have bought the model. It wouldn't have looked like a platform business to them. And that at that time, every company that was trying to raise venture capital was trying to be the Uber of something. It was the Uber for dog walking and the Uber for laundry and the Uber for everything. And all of it was predicated on this idea that we're going to atomize work. We're going to offload all of our labor costs to these, quote unquote, small business owners. And we're going to capture all that value ourselves. So we're never going to have like our overhead is going to be super low. And we are going to get to such a scale by burning your incinerating your venture capital investment. We're going to get to such a scale that we can drive the hardest bargain on both the riders and the drivers.
which had initial sugar rush, right? People made money as a side gig. And they didn't realize, when the rates go down, my insurance, my maintenance, my car payments, my
I mean,
hours, my time.
it was
And so,
originally sold. It was originally sold as like, hey, you're a livery driver who dropped some folks off at dinner and a movie, and now you're just sitting around for 3 hours. You could like make some extra money in that time by driving your own car. Or, hey, you're a stay-at-home mom who just dropped her kids off at soccer practice, and you want to earn a little bit on the side to put in the Disney fund or whatever. When in reality, like if you look at who's driving for Uber, these are people who are making it their at least, full-time plus jobs, a lot of them. And so, yeah, I mean, I think that was also always a sort of fallacy.
and you talk also about the growth of contract labor, of folks who work for these big companies that used to be famous for um, the ping pong tables and the free food and the all of the perks of Silicon Valley. And now there's a whole vast workforce of folks who don't really work for these companies, but are doing the work of those companies. And they're not getting the same benefits, not getting the same pay, not having the same stability. And they are now a huge part of the workforce, and they look different than the folks. They're not getting the stock options of the folks that got in on the ground floor. So those are the people in Pasadena that are struggling to pay the rent, struggling to pay our utility bills, struggling to stay in Pasadena.
Yeah, I mean so I mean I guess the story of VC here is that like what was going on with the gig economy here became an object lesson. Oh, we can innovate. This is a business model innovation that allows us to extract more, deliver higher returns to investors by exploiting workers. And that, the thing about tech and the thing about sort of venture-backed companies is that they are very good at hyping up their own thing. So what happens there doesn't stay there. And this starts to bleed into other industries, the grocery industry, everything. So this became a thing where it was like, oh, now we could do this with all jobs. We could just, outsource everything. Um, or we could, and then the next logical extension is like, and we could just make everybody work on a platform. So now with like AI, you think this magic AI is like answering these questions off the dome or whatever. Like you walk through the self-checkout and it just like knows, I don't know if anybody's shopped at Uniqlo lately, but like you just put the stuff in a basket and it just knows what's in the basket. Or, you go through walk out of an Amazon store and it's just like, oh, how did you know I had granola bar in my bin? It's because there are cameras and there are people in India sitting in a sweatshop who are watching the video and saying, oh, it was a granola bar. Um, or, for I don't know for if folks had heard the story about Waymo's in San Francisco a few months ago, there was a power outage and all the streetlights went out, and the Waymo's freaked out. And it was because they were all reverting back to their human drivers in the Philippines who had to like see, tap into the car and figure out what was going on and actually help the car drive off the road. So like there are humans behind all of this technology. And with AI, it's like supercharged 10x taking this sort of like gig platform model and outsourcing the real work of doing AI onto these platforms. And now other industries are picking up on that and starting to do the same thing. The nursing industry is becoming atomized in this way. And so this is, this sort of business model innovation that was driven by the logic of venture capital to start has now started eroding labor protections across the economy in a variety of ways. And it's really only getting worse. I wrote that chapter actually in 2021. And things have evolved even further in the wrong direction since then.
So the other pillar of the American dream, besides owning the opportunity to own your own business and to have a solid, good paying job where you work 40 hours a week and you make enough to put food on the table and to afford a decent place to live. The last pillar of the American dream is owning your own home. And uh, we sometimes forget just how devastating the Great Recession was to home ownership. 6 million people were foreclosed on. You cite that in your book. And that created an opportunity first for Wall Street and then for venture capital. Wall Street bought up a number of those homes and made them as rentals. And technology and startups helped to create the ability to do that at scale, which didn't exist before. You couldn't own 50,000 single family homes without some mechanism, some technology, some software to be able to manage all those. But now there's this rent to own industry, and you talk about how it's really a throwback to the days when Black people were not welcome to buy homes in white neighborhoods, and so they would have to get um, a white person to put in a bid, or there were some unscrupulous middlemen who would buy the home and then lease it to you essentially, and they would hold the title and often foreclose on the most trivial of reasons. And this is now re raising its head again. Tell us about Divvy.
Well, Divi has a fun epilogue to this story. So, yeah, I mean, you're talking about sort of Jim Crow era policies where in red line neighborhoods, the federal government would not insure mortgages. And so it was very difficult for a Black family to get a mortgage, a traditional mortgage. And so they had to go to these sort of off the books, fly by night, shady, exploitative lenders or, individual people who would take advantage of them and their desire for homeownership. And, the wealth that was stripped from Black families in the middle of the 20th century was like in the billions of dollars just in Chicago alone. I think it was like $2 billion of wealth creation that was stripped from families who had put money into these homes and then had them ripped out from under them. So as we passed fair housing laws and all of that, legally, at least on paper, these models, the sort of roughest edges of them got sanded down and it became illegal to do these sorts of things. But the basic premise of like, hey, you're not in a financial position to get a traditional mortgage, we'll give you this sort of side option to buy in to get like, we're going to add an extra rung to the bottom of the home ownership ladder and help you kind of get up there. Those models have always existed. And there were, I think in 2011 in Detroit, there were more homes that were sold with contracts for deed than with traditional mortgages. So it's not something that ever died. And so I guess it was inevitable that tech and venture capital would look at that and say, hey, the American housing market is the biggest market going. Like if we're about taking on the biggest market opportunities out there, it was inevitable that they were going to get to housing eventually. Um, and so, they supported the sort of corporate roll up of single family homes, but they also started to do these rent to own models, and Divvy is one of them, which is sort of um, sanded down even further the edges of this exploitative model and said, hey, we'll, buy the house for you. and then rent it back to you. And like we'll build in a savings program so that like you'll pay a little bit more on top of rent to like put towards a down payment. And then you'll also like spend the time of the contract getting your financial house in order so that by the end of 3 or 5 years or whatever, you're able to buy the house from us with a traditional mortgage. Um, and so they took advantage of people's desperation. Now, these are people who, by definition, are desperate to get into homeownership. They don't have good credit, or they don't have, they're not able to get a traditional mortgage. They really want to be a homeowner. And so Divvy does, and Divvy's not the only one of these companies. There's several that will, they'll buy the house from you and then they set a price that, okay, in 5 years when the contract is up, you are contractually obligated to buy the house back from us at this pre-agreed price. That of course is going to be five increases 5-10% every year, and is set, assumes that there's certain growth in the market, et cetera. So it is extremely risky for folks who are buying in to just make the bet that in 5 years, this house is actually going to be worth that much money. Now, obviously, it often isn't. So they're stuck at the end of the 5 years with this contract, and now they can't buy the home from the company
No
because they
more.
can't get there's no
Yeah, they
mortgage.
can't get a
Nobody's
mortgage.
lending to you because the house isn't worth that much. So they can't get the mortgage. So now they paid all this money in to the house and they've got to walk away. And guess who owns the house? This company, right? So it's sort of this backdoor way to like get people to pay, take on all the responsibilities of homeownership because of course this is going to be your house one day. So you've got to fix all of the little stuff around there and you've got to take care of the landscaping and do all of that stuff. Meanwhile, they own the house. And if you default on the contract, they keep the house. So this was sort of a backdoor way for them to build a portfolio of corporately owned single family homes, which they did, and that was working great for them until interest rates started to go up. Ultimately, long story short, the company went out of business. And they had no, I mean, all the reporting I did for the book, all the reporters I had talked to who had, reported on their business model, none of us could figure out what happens to the people who are living in these homes if the company goes out of business. And we still don't know. They say that they have, sort of sold the portfolio of homes to this other corporate landlord, but that corporate landlord doesn't, necessarily have to live up to the contract terms that Divvy had with them. So it's just, again, an example of we're gonna find an innovation on the business model of home ownership. We're going to extract everything we can out of it and use software to do that. And we're going to offload all of the risk to customers, workers, society, whatever. And when things go south, we'll walk away. The investors aren't going to lose anything except for their original investment. And that to me, like the writing the housing chapter was so infuriating. And these types of companies are just, if you listen to the way that the founder and the investors talk about what they're doing, it's really, really will make you see red.
This reminds me of the Disney classic from the 1930s of The Sorcerer's Apprentice, in which the water keeps rising and he keeps bailing, and it just becomes a chaotic and ultimately hopeless effort to just keep bailing when the water is getting higher and higher. And we've created this system. So this is a good time to transition to the alternatives. And Trio is sort of the anti-Divvy. So both, if you could tell the story of Trio and how that might point a way to a more stable and sustainable, a more Warren Buffett approach to helping entrepreneurs build businesses that provide stable, good paying jobs where people can afford to pay their taxes and buy homes.
Yeah. So Trio is a company, as much as possible in the book, I tried to compare, to demonstrate the challenges that, venture capital is creating for the entrepreneur innovation environment by pointing to a company that was doing a similar thing or addressing the same issue in a more societally beneficial way that couldn't get traction because the VC-based model was sucking all of the oxygen out of the room. And Trio was basically, I mean, I can't even really call it a competitor to Divvy because its market share was so much smaller. But they had come up with a model for basically rent to own that did not offload all of the risk to the consumer or to society. It found a way to protect, um, still make a profit. Like they had a workable business model, but they found a way to de-risk the transaction for the homeowner. And the transition rate from renter to owner of the customers in their cohort was 80%, whereas the transition rate for Divvy was south of 50%. And so it's just clear on paper that there were ways to solve this problem of, people who wanted to get into homeownership, but like were just on the verge of being able to qualify for a traditional mortgage, creating new options for them to build that wealth, and stability for their families without forcing all of this risk onto them. And it just was going to grow slower. It wasn't going to have as much of a market penetration as Divvy would have as quickly as it did. And my point there was to say, why can't we find ways to invest in these types of companies? Like the only reason that Trio couldn't have been, built out this model is because the investors were like, hey, there's no grand slam potential here, so I'm not going to bother. But it could have been a double or a triple. And why aren't there methods for investing in these types of companies that where the investors win also? And I think that's the area, the deep irony of venture capital is they talk about how disruptive they are and they're going to go into all these industries and they're heterodox thinkers and they're going to shake things up and do things differently. And the one area where they have not innovated at all is within venture capital. They've been doing it the same way and doubling down on this same approach for the last 40 years. And so my call for them is to think outside the box and like design portfolios in a different way that can take advantage of the real organic potential of companies like Trio and others that I talk about in the book. And there are some investors out there doing that. And, I'm doing a lot of work now to try to find the levers, policy-wise and otherwise, to convince more capital to go to investors like that.
We took a stab at that when I was city manager of Ventura. One of the council members um, really felt that we would not be able to generate jobs in Ventura without access to capital. And so we partnered with a Silicon Valley um, venture capital fund. We invested $10 million in that fund, and we said at least 2 million of that had to be invested in Ventura entrepreneurs. And we had an incubator behind City Hall in an old county building that they had left. And there was a two people startup in that incubator, and the venture capital firm invested in them. And today they are Trade Desk, still headquartered in Ventura. They're a middleman on digital ads. I'm not sure they're doing all that much that's socially useful, but they've grown into a $13 billion company with 3,900 employees around the world. And they're headquartered in Ventura. That's been a huge shot in the arm for Ventura's economy to have those good jobs that were sparked with help from venture capital. That's a positive ending. What are the things that we could do either in partnership with venture capital or supplementing or even supplanting venture capital at the local level in a city like Pasadena? And by we, the government, the people, our Chamber of Commerce, smart people who want to invest their money in something besides, um, uh, you know, investments in less than savory things. What can be done at the local level? What should Pasadena be doing to pioneer alternative ways that are healthier and more sustainable for genuine prosperity?
Yeah, well, governments are and local governments in particular, via pension funds and other investment vehicles, are some of those institutional investors that I mentioned before that put the money into venture capital funds. And so at scale, and and at the state level for sure, local state governments have a lot of influence over how venture capitalists structure their funds. And because they are such, such large investors in VC funds, I mean, like CalPERS, for example, is, can drive this industry on its own if it really wanted to. And so I think there's an opportunity for cities like Pasadena to look at how their portfolios are invested. And I think a lot of institutional investors don't think about VC. I mean, they just take for granted the story they've been told that plays a very important role in our portfolio, even though it's a very small percentage typically of the overall portfolio that your pensions are probably invested in. It is playing an outsized role in that it delivers, or in theory, it's delivering, more than the stock market would. And then when certain assets are down, VC is up. And so it plays this important role in balancing out the risk. But that's not actually, I mean, those are assumptions that we really need to examine. So I would say, like, look at the returns. Is it really providing all that much value? What are the funds that you're invested in? Have they been good for, housing or whatever priorities are important for Pasadena? Are they exploiting workers? I mean, this irony that pension funds are the ones that are investing in companies like Uber, which are pulling the bottom out from under all of the protections that unions have fought so hard to create for workers, is crazy. So, I mean, there's a lot there that if you started asking those questions, I think you could influence a lot just by asking the questions of the fund managers, right? And they would start to say like, "Oh, this is actually something I need to respond to. People are paying attention to this 2% I'm taking off the top, or whatever it is." And I think that would go a long way to really starting a conversation that really nobody's having right now.
Well, for those of you who've joined us tonight, we haven't had a lot in the chat. I should have encouraged you to put your questions and comments in the chat. I apologize for that. It's our first time out. We'll try to make these more interactive as we move along. It's been absolutely brilliant to have you, Catherine, on this first episode. Um, I serve as the council's representative on our fire and police pension fund. The city doesn't invest in stocks and companies, but we have a closed pension system for everyone who's all of our recipients are already retired, but it's $105 million of investments. And we are beginning to think about an ethical compass for that. And we can credit folks who've been deeply unhappy with the fact that some of those investments are implicated in the war crimes that are going on in Gaza. And that has sparked a broader thinking about where exactly are we putting our money? And are we putting our money in a way that builds prosperity, that makes for a just and prosperous society, and that reinforces our own community and our own community's values? So I welcome you to be part of all of those discussions. And I very much thank you for being part of our first episode of City Talk. Thank you,
I'm
Catherine.
honored. I'm honored. Thank you so much. Thanks for having me.
Okay. All right. Until next time, next month, we'll have another episode of City Talk.
Bye.